The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to another event in the QueBIT webinar series. Appreciate everybody taking time out of their day. And if you're on the West Coast, I guess it's a late morning, but appreciate you joining. Today we're going to talk about more conceptually than anything, how to make integrated business planning a reality. You know, the term IBP has a meaning, right, in terms of running a monthly process that should drive integration of multiple operational functions. And most IBP processes include finance to some degree as well. But what we want to talk about today is the importance of truly integrating those functions and the data flow and the planning between them to really drive the type of synergies you need to thrive as an organization and achieve all your strategic objectives. So that's what the vast majority of the focus will be on today. Less of the rigorous structured process and more about how you turn that process terminology into real action to drive those synergies. Just real quick, by way of introduction, my name is Dallas Crawford. I'm the general manager of our advanced analytics team here at QueBIT, and my primary focus is business development for really all of our solutions and services involving the application of statistical modeling and advanced decision making and applying those to operational planning processes. So whether it's predicting likely outcomes like demand forecasting, which we'll talk about today, or optimizing the decisions, whether it's calculating the optimal safety stock or the optimal supply plan to fulfill that demand. All those types of things is where this team focuses. And Dan is the technical sales leader, manager, and the subject matter expert with over 25 years experience, specifically in manufacturing. He was the CFO of a manufacturing company. He's been in technical software sales leaderships in numerous roles from a pre-sale standpoint, and really understands how to leverage technology to drive real differences in your operational planning and across your supply chain. So we are the speakers today. Just a quick housekeeping note. Today's webinar is being recorded. It's a part of our advanced webinar series. Our next upcoming webinar will be on Thursday, April 9th. So we typically run these on second Thursdays of each month, but it'll be Thursday, April 9th, same time, and you can access it via the same location on QueBIT.com/news events, where you can see, again, all of our current webinars, but we also, if you've missed previous webinars that you were interested in, we also have a video catalog in that same location where you can go and review past recordings, including this one. As I mentioned, this one is being recorded. We'll send out a link to this recording, so if you feel like you missed something as we cover the material during today's presentation, you'll be able to get that recording via email within a 24-hour period, and you'll have access to it. One last thing from a housekeeping perspective, if you look in your toolbar for the GoToWebinar that you join, you should see a question pane where you can type questions as we go. Dan, who will be co-presenting, is also monitoring the question pane, and some of the questions we'll hold until the end, probably most of them, but please type them in there as we go so that we don't forget. Another reason we like you to type them in, or I'm sorry, so that you don't forget to ask them later. Another reason why we like them to be typed in is if it's something very timely or relevant to what we're presenting at the moment, we will kind of pause to make sure we address it. So please use that question pane, and as I mentioned, Dan will be actively monitoring it. So real quick, as I mentioned, today will be mostly focused on conceptually why this is important and why getting it right is so important. We'll talk a little bit about our Galileo platform, which we feel is uniquely positioned to actually enable the integration of all these functions and processes. But more of today's presentation will be focused on why it's important, the value of it, so to speak. We'll spend a little time talking about how we can help you solve it, and we'll be accessible to you. You saw our emails in that first slide if you want to follow up directly with Dan or myself. We'll close with some benefits, summarized benefits of what the impacts have been for companies who've started this journey, and then obviously we'll take questions as we mentioned before. Before we get too deep in it, I want to talk about a term that I think is used, somewhat loosely and regularly. Everyone talks about planning agility and being agile, and it's really, really important that we think about what this means to an operation, the ability to really be fleet of foot. One definition would be one of my favorite players, Barry Sanders, who always had the ability to seemingly stop on a dime while running and cut upfield in one fluid motion almost, right? To where the defenders couldn't catch up to him and still achieve his objective. And really, that's what being agile from a planning standpoint is all about as well as a company. It's about being able to deliver consistent quality to your customers while at a consistent cost rate that's predictable to your business, while dealing with all of the wild variability and constraints you have to deal with as a company. There are many things that you will encounter, whether planned or unplanned, from a variability standpoint, that you're going to have to react to. And the definition of really being agile is having the ability to encounter that roadblock or that potential barrier or that slight variance, shift immediately, and be able to continue progressing up the field as you imagine without skipping a beat. And again, maintaining some continuity in your cost structure, in your delivery cycle. And the only way to do that is to have a flexible, integrated planning system. Because when those variations creep up, if you're planning in silos, you immediately add days, hours, what have you, to the decision-making process with extra layers of communication. And it's really, really important that everyone is, singing from the same sheet of music figuratively, or reading off the same data set and the same fact set when making those critical real-time decisions to satisfy your clients, right? So understanding what agility is, let's move into why integrated planning is imperative. Why is it so important? This was a poll of supply chain executives about what was most important to them. And I want to hone in. You can see the macro areas, obviously containing costs, managing globalization, and being able to leverage different regional potential benefits, whether it's sourcing materials or manufacturing materials there. All of those types of things are fairly obvious, right? Executives want visibility. One area that was interesting, though, was that risk area. Typically we associate risk and strategic planning with either the Office of Finance or maybe Chief Risk and Compliance, but this was one of the top areas, if not the top area, for operational planning leaders as well. And current events will teach us that we have to be ready for almost anything and to deal with supreme disruption at any point. And those risks aren't, whether they're external or internal, they always have the ability to have impact on our supply chains and our operations and how we move goods and deliver them ultimately to our customers. They impact demand. And it's not just, again, current events, it's weather, it's all these different types of things that can come together and drive disruption. And so we can't associate risk with just strategic functions. Everybody has to be prepared to manage risk in conjunction with all of these other things that you see here, containing costs, maintaining good intimate relationships with your customers to make sure products and goods are available and delivered on time, right when they need it. If you look at this supply chain hierarchy, it really illustrates what is seemingly a pyramid of, cascading down. You set strategic objectives, at the top, right? You want to drive, either revenue growth for a category, or you want to set in place some policies, whether they be service level agreements that you have to meet with, your top customers or your core customers, or really any customers. And then you forecast and set inventory plans and things of that nature tactically to ensure that you can fulfill those strategic objectives you set. You've got your operational needs. If you're a distributor, you've got work center scheduling, you've got order management and material movement. The point is, while these all seem somewhat stacked and separate and siloed, they all need to move in concert with one another, and they're all dependent upon one another. When you set strategic objectives, there's a high dependency on the ability to execute down at that lower level of order cycle and material movement. Same way back up. Your network design, for example, is going to be highly dependent on, or should be highly dependent on, where are you seeing the vast majority of your demand? Where are your locations sitting today? How can you fulfill that demand best? That should guide how you draw the network of your supply chain. And so the point is, all of these things, again, have to be very seamlessly connected in order for you to operate at the peak. And the last thing I'll mention is, we've talked a lot about the operational functions, and you can see what we really see as sitting at the core of a good integrated business planning process. The thing that's most important to get right is that demand plan. And the reason is, everything, both upstream and downstream, obviously all these functional areas have different variability and constraints within them that impact them. But the easiest way to take pressure off your supply chain is to be ahead of the curve on what's being demanded, where is it being demanded from, and then being able to consolidate and build those other functions around it. So if you know what demand is, you can easily, with confidence, you can look out a few months and build your supply plan around it. You can look out a few months or weeks and have your inventory plan built around it. You can have your production team building to those specifications. And then it's really critical that all of that integrates seamlessly into an operational revenue plan. So when you have that final consensus constrained unit plan that you're going to do every week, or if you're reviewing this process in a monthly cadence, you have that final constrained unit plan available. You need to convert that to revenue in order to maximize finances, visibility, but also accuracy. And so seamlessly being able to turn your operational unit plan into an operational revenue plan at a detailed level is something that's really, really key. It's an area where a lot of organizations break down in this process and really lose that continuity. And maintaining that continuity is important because, again, finance is making investment decisions, expense decisions, strategic decisions, et cetera, with some reliance. They're making profitability commitments to the street. They're making revenue statements, and they're making those assumptions and statements with the dependency on getting everything right underneath. One thing I'll mention lastly, and then I'll pass it to Dan to kind of walk you through from a business case standpoint how this all comes together, is just some of the detailed intricacies. So this is a busy slide a bit, but it's really important that when you're trying to integrate multiple functions, you have a strong consideration for how those functions plan today, how they need to be able to continuously view the data that's relevant to them. And then that's going to drive how you can bring it all together. So no matter, where you sit, oftentimes starting with a baseline, detailed predictive forecast is going to be the strongest way to automate that process and accurately kick off your planning process. But then sales is going to need to come in and make inputs to the plan, right? And they typically care about it in a monthly capacity, occasionally, depending on industry. Sometimes they care about weekly. Their units of measure are typically either in units or in revenue, right, for that sales team. And so you have to be cognizant of that. Operations is going to have a different view, whether it's production or inventory or replenishment. Oftentimes they want to see that data, your production and inventory likely on a weekly basis. Your replenishment planners may want to have visibility down to the day level to deal with some of that variation. It's important to understand that, so that when you design a system, it has to be something that can handle multiple time frames in terms of planning horizons, different types of periodicity and things of that nature. And they really don't care about revenue dollars, or I shouldn't say they don't care, but typically they're planning in units. That's their primary metric. And then when you look at finance, they're really looking more macro. Typically they care about, a monthly P&L, even if it's down to a division level or location level. They're thinking about the balance sheet and cash flow. They're thinking about some of the inputs to their planning cycle, some of the more strategic things that may be impacting them. And they really want to understand revenue impacts, profitability impact, margin impact. And so it's about bringing these different units of measure together, again, whether it's cost, pricing, margin, revenue, or units, having those be able to sit in a shared system, being able to give each of these functional groups the ability to plan on whatever horizon they want, whatever time frames they want, but deal with it in a consolidated system, and then have that available for a truly integrated executive review where, again, people are pulling from comparable data sources, looking at the same data sets, not passing around 40 to 50 spreadsheets or comparing whose dashboard is the most current or the most accurate. That's the only way to break down these disparate processes. And now I'll let Dan talk a little bit about the financial and operational impacts that you can see from breaking down these silos.
Great. Thanks, Dallas. Good intro. Thank you very much. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, three areas we're going to look at. So, what are some of the positive impacts of doing integrated business planning correctly? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the success factors involved in implementing an IBP system. And then we're going to go through a quick ROI case study on a fictitious business, but based on some studies that the Gartner Group has implemented in the past. So first we'll talk about a little bit about what are some of the positive impacts or opportunities. And again, this comes from a Gartner roundtable of demand planning professionals, but this could easily apply to the supply side too. So what are some of the KPIs or the key performance indicators that we can affect by doing IBP correctly? And so IBP is basically a process, typically a monthly process looking out 18 to 24 months that is typically on a monthly cadence. And that's typically around, a product review and then a demand review and then a supply review and then pulling that all together from a management and finance review. But some of the KPIs that we will focus on in that monthly cadence is around driving certain customer service KPIs. So perfect order fulfillment, on time in full, reducing cycle times, whether that's deliveries or manufacturing cycle times, by being able to match demand to supply. And then some of the supply chain KPIs. So really around, getting the forecast correctly, and then reducing inventory by being able to, build or distribute inventory, to a very discrete planning level will really drive a reduction in inventory. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that in our example ROI case study. And then certainly everyone struggles with new product launch execution. That's typically part of the product review section of an IBP process where we'll get merchandisers, we'll get sales together and really look at, hey, what are we going to do with this new product? Do we want to introduce a new product? What do we do if the product fails? It's all about really reducing the risk around new product launch and being able to supply inventory for a new product that really takes off. And then linking production scheduling kind of links in with network design. If you're a manufacturer, getting an IBP process where you're balancing supply and demand will really drive a more efficient production schedule. And certainly from a distribution standpoint, helps you look at network design. And then drives lower expediting and less unsaleable or waste inventory. And then some of the more high level business KPIs is getting the right inventory at the right place at the right time and the first time, so that you can reduce product transfers and stale inventory out in your supply chain. And then if you are abiding by service level agreements, so if you're doing business with Walmart, they're going to have a certain level of service level agreements in place that if you break, can become quite costly. So, really, again, going back to the balancing of that demand and supply and product review and then linking that to finance will really help you drive, these service level agreements. And then, stronger sales relationships, because getting demand and supply in balance will help you drive higher levels of customer satisfaction and certainly stronger sales relationships. So let's go on and look at some of the success factors that are part of an IBP implementation. First and foremost is the team. So that executive sponsor that understands the impact of a strong IBP process and can link those more strategic and technical planning processes to the overall goals of the organization and be able to communicate that across the organization. And then the supply chain analysts, managers, and supply chain analysts in the organization that are really responsible for driving the different processes around demand and supply, and pulling together the data, being able to do the slice and dice and scenario analysis. And certainly, last but not least, is getting the data right. And typically, a lot of our customers will rely on us, rely on QueBIT for pulling that data together, creating the right data mart to support this process, and having the access to what is typically multiple data sources pulled together and synchronized so that this process is enabled consistently across the organization. And then supporting that team is the platform. So it's all about getting the data right, standardizing the data, creating that supply chain data mart. If you have, if data, big data, IoT type data is part of the demand or supply side of the equation, then being able to data mine that and consolidate that information so that it makes sense from a rolled up level can be important. We really see in-memory processing is huge because that allows you to do those what-if scenarios and slice and dicing of the data, answering questions on the fly during the review meetings. That in-memory processing is crucial because if you don't have that, then typically it's, what if we do this? An executive will ask a question during a review meeting. What if we do this? Well, we can get back to you tomorrow on that. No, you got to be able to make a change, do a what-if scenario, and answer that question immediately in a review meeting to drive that process forward. Cloud development really allows you to look at and deploy this information more widely across the organization, and then certainly easy interfaces, visualizations, reporting, charting, graphing, and then automating the process. those are some key considerations from a platform standpoint. I'm going to talk in more detail around the justification, but the first and foremost is improved forecast accuracy, and we'll talk about how improving forecast accuracy drives significant ROI in the organization. Some of the other things that we see is just rather than using Excel to analyze data and pull data together, we kind of flip that equation where it used to be 80% of our time was manipulating data to now we spend more time analyzing data and making decisions. I talked about new product forecasting. Dallas spoke eloquently on risk mitigation. Certainly better and faster decision making kind of falls into that in-memory processing, allows you to be more nimble and agile, as Dallas has mentioned. And then certainly competitive pressures and staying one step ahead of your competitors are some of the large justification areas. Some of those are very soft, and I'm going to go to a more qualitative or quantitative view in just a moment. So in conclusions around these success factors, a strong foundation of people and data is critical. Certainly QueBIT can help from identifying the right people to put this team together for an organization. And we also find that organizations come to us to really help close the gaps in data, the analytics and processes by investing in a vendor like QueBIT and the platform that we provide. And then so we're going to go into proving ROI business case. We really think that can be more of an iterative process where you start, say, with demand and get that right, and then move into supply. And that helps create buy-in in the organization. But let's take a look at an example business case for improved IBP. So this comes from an article that was published by Gartner called "Win the Business Case for Investment to Improve Forecast Accuracy." And the findings of this study shows that for every 1% forecast accuracy improvement, you will get 3 different areas where you'll see some significant ROI. So for every 1% forecast accuracy improvement, you should see a 7% reduction in inventory. So let's talk in more detail of that. For an example, the red asterisks are just example metrics. So say, for example, we had $100 million worth of inventory in our organization. And so for every 1% forecast accuracy improvement, we'll see a 7% reduction. So if we have 100 million, we should see $7 million reduction in inventory. And let's say, for example, our inventory carrying costs are 5%. And I think this is a very reasonable number. We've talked to customers that said, no, ours more around 7. No, ours are more around 9. So 5% is very conservative. So if we take a 5% carrying cost at $7 million worth of inventory is a $350,000 reduction in carrying costs. And so if we were to, and we see this, we have many customers that have seen significantly higher improvement in forecast accuracy, but the example we're using here is a 15%. So if we use 15% at a $350,000 carrying cost, that's a yearly reduction in carrying costs and inventory of $5.2 million. Another area is around inventory obsolescence. So the example here is if we have $5 million in current stale inventory or obsolete inventory, at 9%, we're looking at about a $450,000 improvement. That could be a yearly or a one-time. You'd have to do some analysis of your business. And then the study also shows a 2% reduction in transportation costs. So again, if we had $5 million in transportation costs, could be higher or lower for $100 million in inventory. 2% reduction is $100,000. A 15% improvement gets you to about $1.5 million. And so adding those together gets you a net return of about $7.2 million.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to just keep in context here is all of these are relative, as Dan just covered, including improvements in accuracy, right? We'll talk in a second about how we help you achieve those, but for some of your products, you may be doing pretty well and you'll see maybe 5 to 10% improvements. For some at a granular level, maybe you're doing poorly and the improvement will be more pronounced. You may have some make to order stuff where it's better to not forecast them and treat them a little bit differently. But on average, these are examples of really the power of what can be delivered. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no, I was kind of wrapping up there. But yeah, so example, plug your numbers into this. Dallas and I are certainly available. We've done this kind of business case for several customers, and sit down with them and say, okay, what's your inventory level? If you just did a raw, hey, we're going to cut inventory by 10%, then let's use the reduced number. What are your carrying costs? So those are the kind of things that we can come to a prospect or a customer and say, hey, let's help you build the case, because ultimately the person that's responsible for delivering these type of systems are going to have to go to an executive committee and say, hey, this is why we need it, and here's some of the benefits. And so these are some of the things that we can help you with and help developing that kind of presentation to justify the business case for these type systems. So I'll turn it back over to Dallas.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep.
I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because I want to leave adequate time for Q&A, and this really is meant to be more informational than anything. But some of the core tenets that your solution or platform needs in order to service, again, a truly integrated business planning process. So if you really want to bring together product review, sales planning, demand planning, inventory planning, replenishment planning, supply planning, and if you're a manufacturer, production planning, and then being able to integrate finance into that. If you truly want to deliver that, which is quite possible, and not show up again to a review meeting with disparate spreadsheets or different charts, there are some really key kind of core tenets you need. The first is strong data aggregation and preparation. So our system allows you to plan all of those functions within the system via different modules. However, there's no requirement that we come in, and in fact, we haven't had one customer where we come in and rip and replace the whole thing. Some people start with us owning just demand. Some people may start with demand and supply, and they continue to do all their production and inventory in other systems. Some start with demand and inventory, and they continue to plan in other systems. It's not really about consolidating where you plan. It's about having the ability to pull in all that data, incorporate it into the planning process, and regardless of where those plans are entered or submitted, being able to easily aggregate them for review in a consolidated platform. Another key piece, though, is being able to deliver best-in-class statistical forecasting. And that really goes back to the idea that ultimately demand is at the heart of really everything we're trying to do, right? Ultimately, whether we're doing things to drive demand and shape demand, or we're reacting to shifts in demand, everything is dependent upon what our customers want, when they want it, and we have to have it where they need it. And so the better you can forecast that demand, again, you take continuous pressure off that supply chain. So being able to have an accurate baseline forecast for both units and revenue, being able to aggregate all this data, pull it all together, and then deliver it in a very integrated, powerful planning and reporting engine that can be configured to your needs. Again, going back to some of the different ways these functions want to view data over different time periods. That's really kind of the core building blocks of any system that you plan to select for this type of endeavor, and it's certainly what our Galileo solution can provide. Couple other key kind of differentiators for our system. One is highly automated. So we tend to model at the most granular level when we're looking at units or revenue. So if you are a large manufacturer, it could be SKU by customer or by customer shipped to, which can have a lot of value when you go back to reducing transportation costs or reducing carrying costs. Being able to source and produce materials at the nearest point to your end customer demand, which is at the ship to level, can be very, very critical. And so predicting, again, either units or revenue at the lowest possible level is critically important. So that type of scale is really key. Same thing for a retailer. You know, if you've got tons of SKUs and tons of locations, you need to be able to predict demand, or for a wholesale distributor at the item location level. And in order to do that and to model those all independently and react to the different drivers that impact those at the lowest level, it has to be automated, right? There's no, you know, one of our larger clients has 700,000 SKUs and 7,000 locations. There's no team of planners in the world that could manage those billions of different combinations that they have to account for. And so having an automated system be able to scale and handle that on a weekly level really gives them tons of flexibility in their baseline planning process. And then having a good system that's user-friendly on the front end, where they can come in, make adjustments to those plans on the supply side, react to shifts in demand, maybe push orders around, manage vendors, manage fulfillment in certain ways, those types of things. Having the ability to do those in a system and then consolidate it up and report on it can be really key. I'm not going to spend too much time in the weeds here, but one of the things that we tend to do either differently or a really strong job of is pulling multiple data sets into the planning process. So a lot of times when we meet with customers, whether it's on the demand or supply side, there are always data sets that they wish they could incorporate into their planning process, that whether it's system limitations or human constraints in terms of workforce and capital, they just haven't had the bandwidth to bring those in. Because we do this all in an automated fashion, we're able to pull in not just their historical data, which you see at the top, you know, things like historical orders, revenue, pricing, new products, new markets, things of that nature, but also external data, who their competition is, what they may be carrying, categories they're strong in, demographic data, so microeconomic data, macroeconomic data. If you're in a business that's weather or climate dependent, being able to incorporate those in the analysis. So in this flow, you're looking at demand and then breaking out the seasonality, identifying the trend, regressing any causal variables or factors against that trend, whether it's internal things like promotions and ad spend, or again, external things like weather, competition, demographics, being able to account for those at the lowest possible level and produce a very accurate, forward-looking, you know, anywhere from 12 to 18 months to some of our customers plan on 5 to 10-year horizons. So we can really accommodate any of those needs, and then they land in a place where you can do some powerful planning, make adjustments, reporting, those types of things. And the last thing I'll mention again is, because you see these functions here don't mean that you have to plan them within the system. While we can incorporate and account for or accommodate all these types of planning, if you're comfortable with supply in another system, we may just load in that ultimate output so that you at least have visibility to, here's my demand, here's what we can actually fulfill, right? Here's what we have available to promise or commit based on our orders and receipts, and here's where we are, right? Having that visibility all there can be critical. We talked about using causal variables or predictors and being able to include them in the process more systematically, and again, accounting for potentially a lot of data sources that you just don't have the ability to pull in today, and doing those in a quantitative fashion at the lowest level, right? So categories or different SKUs will be impacted, you know, in, I'm trying to think of a simple category, flooring, right? We have a customer, large flooring manufacturer. Different climates create different preferences for soft versus hard flooring, tile versus hardwood, all those types of considerations. And so it's really important to consider these factors at the absolute lowest level. We talked about some of these advantages as we went of our system again in particular, but more so if you get this process right, to not make this too QueBIT centric or talk too much about our Galileo predictive planning system. Ultimately, what you want to get out of a good integrated process and what we know we can deliver for our clients are a few things. Incorporating an accurate forecast, right? And giving you, more important than that accurate baseline forecast, because there's always going to be different elements outside of your control where user inputs, adjustments, overrides have to be made. But giving them the ability to adjust those and interact with different things. So one of our clients, for example, is in a heavily weather-dependent business, and one of the things they run scenarios on manually is what happens if we have a warmer winter, if we have, a colder winter, if we have X amount of days below freezing, how does that impact our products versus the normal rates? What if we invest more promotion dollars in this category or in this region? Having the ability to interact with a statistical engine and actually rerun those scenarios rather than just guessing what the impact is going to be can be huge. The automation piece is definitely critical, because one of the ways you take waste out of planning process and deliver agility is breaking down manual steps. We'll talk about one client example shortly, but they reduced 60% of their time in their annual planning process and then another 50% in their monthly process. And if you add that all together, that's huge time savings of their field employees to be spending more time with customers, or their buyers being able to spend more time negotiating with vendors. So giving people time back and automating the things that can be automated is critical. And then finally, again, being able to review multiple versions of the plan, multiple scenarios, and that last piece, leveraging forecast value add, measuring it and being able to review it will help drive the automation that we just talked about. If sales reps are consistently sandbagging, or if they are overstating because they want to stuff the channel and make sure they have enough inventory to satisfy their customers, or they're just really optimistic, those things can impact how you set your fulfillment strategies or your inventory strategies. And if they're consistently doing a poor job at that, you want to be able to measure it. Same thing for if a system started to erode from an accuracy standpoint. You want to be able to measure it and measure the value that's provided at each step, so that you can potentially eliminate any wasted steps of your planning process. Two quick very high level case studies, and then we can close it out. First is a very large manufacturer of ours. So, planning well over 20,000 SKUs, well over 5,000 customer ship to locations. And the most important thing is they had 30 plants on 30 different ERPs. So I won't get into how difficult that can be from a data management standpoint for most systems, but we're able to handle that seamlessly due to some unique things in the integration layer. But bringing those together and being able to integrate, so previously they had their external customers were manually forecasting in Excel, their plant managers were manually forecasting in a different system, and then their internal box plants had a system that they were really, really comfortable with. And we were able to take over the external and the plant manager forecast within our system, but just pull in a feed from their internal box plant that they were comfortable with, so that they could see all types of demand, all versions of the plan that were coming in, and then feed their production execution system on the back end, and really drive some efficiencies. So we talked about that. We gave them a single view for their executive review, an integrated financial forecast. So that unit plan is seamlessly via costing and pricing information being loaded in, converted to a revenue plan without any extra effort. You simply flip back and forth. So they had an integrated financial seed that went straight to that plan. And then finally, they sent once they had that constrained consensus unit plan, it went directly to their production scheduling system, and they were able to feed that on a weekly basis. One other example, this was the one where I mentioned cutting both planning cycles for their monthly plan, and the amount of their annual cuts actually aren't in here. That was the 60%, but they also took out a lot of data manipulation and data wrangling steps, as you see on the right side. But this was a public case study for us, Safe Flight Auto Glass Group. They have multiple different types of windshields and side windows. And if you know, they have to be ready for someone to show up at your house when you call with exactly the size of windshield you need. And so very complex planning process, and we were able to help significantly improve their forecast accuracy at a location level, as you can see in the bottom right, an insanely accurate forecast, but also beyond improving their accuracy, improving the integration of their field and financial plan, and then driving out lots of waste in the planning process. So we'll close it kind of with some high-level thoughts. First, mature IBP processes really help yield successful execution of your growth programs. Going back to that agility being the key word, when you launch new products, you certainly want to be right on the front end of them, or as close to right as possible. But in addition to that, you want to be able to be nimble if they take off, or if they don't. Most of us, we hope that they do, so that you can support that and make sure that you don't run out of critical things that your customers are demanding just because they got a little too popular for what you expected. So being able to support your new programs, same thing with pricing and promotions. Again, if you're running a successful campaign, the worst thing you can do is run out of a good or service that's in high demand because you just didn't plan the shape the right way, right? A true integration leads to more aligned strategic plans. Can't stress enough that beyond agility, it's about maintaining alignment. If you go back to that pyramid, when you set those strategic goals, you want everything happening at the tactical and operation and execution levels to align and really be in support of that overall corporate strategy. We've talked about reversing the 80-20 rule. Dan spent some time on this. But when this process is mature and truly integrated, you spend a lot less time worrying about whose numbers are right. Did I pass you this spreadsheet? Did you send me back your most current version? And again, you're focused on, here is the current state. How do we make adjustments? How do we run scenarios to react to it? And then it's a collaborative platform that's a trusted source. So I will pause there and thank everyone for their time today, and then open it up for questions. Again, you can type your questions right into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar.
Hey, Dallas, we had one question come in while people are adding any additional questions. One question that came in during the presentation. So we talked a little bit about, people and data are key, but the question was, what kind of data considerations? Can you expound a little bit more on, what sort of things we need to be aware of from a data standpoint? I'll take the question. Is that so? Data certainly is dependent on the type of business. If let's look at manufacturers, so data could be different for a process manufacturer versus a discrete manufacturer, especially on the supply side. Things like from a discrete standpoint, it could be work center with capacity by head count and by machinery, whereas process industry is mostly about machine throughput. So it could be certainly gathering that type of data differently in a manufacturing, even in process or discrete manufacturing, could be a little different. From a distribution standpoint, the data is more around warehouse capacity and maybe routes and network design and those kind of things. Another area that is a big consideration is the number of ERPs. I know we touched a little bit on this, but the number of ERPs can be a significant challenge, in pulling all that data together in one system of record where you can, actually go against different data across those ERPs. And I guess I'll warn is that thinking that you have an ERP and just going with their recommended planning solution is not always the best, because many of those ERPs do great at transactions and execution, but not so great from a planning standpoint. And then, I guess another area around data is around time horizons and dimensions, and, kind of standardizing that planning process. I mean, we work with a customer that has, one ERP. You would think that the data would be pretty good, but the problem was they have, 10, 20 different divisions. Each division planned differently, monthly in one division, weekly in another division, at a product category in one division, and down to the SKU level in another. So really standardizing that data, standardizing the methodology so that data supports it can be a big consideration. And then, being able to flexibly create the data mart to support your planning process, and testing that data, doing very quick sprints and POCs around the data so that everyone is kind of on the same page from a standardization of the data, and being able to rapidly develop the data model to support your business, I think is a key consideration and certainly a strength from a QueBIT implementation standpoint. So those are some data considerations that you might think of. Dallas, if you had any more comments around that.
No, I think you covered it
Okay.
quite eloquently. Not sure I could have done any better.
Thank you. All right, let me see if there's another question here. Yeah, so question on typical implementation time. So maybe Dallas, you could give us some.
Yeah, it goes back to, obviously we talked about a lot of different things, right? We talked about from a functional standpoint, right? How much of your current planning process do you think really needs work? Where do you think you're strong? So, if you're really strong on the demand side, but you need to clean up your supply and maybe capacity and, one other segment, do you feel like the whole thing needs an overhaul? Are you really good downstream and you just want to focus on demand and getting that right and getting a more accurate forecast? So it kind of depends on functionally what type of module we're talking about implementing, and then also the quality of data, the state of data and where it is. But just to be really general, I guess if we just hone in on maybe demand and supply or demand and inventory, I would say 3 to 4 months generally is a good, safe, conservative implementation period. Again, with all the caveats that I just mentioned, or if you needed to roll out something further. But this is a this is a system that can be stood up relatively quickly due to all the data integration capabilities we just talked about.
Yeah, good. Let's see. I think we got time for maybe one more here. Yeah, there's another question here around. Let's see. It's see if I can. Yeah. All right. So it boils down to what's the best algorithms? I mean, we talked about predictive and using advanced analytics and predictive algorithms to seed a demand and supply forecast. And the question is, what's the best algorithms to use for demand and supply forecasting? I'll take a swing at that. So again, dependent upon the data and what kind of what you're actually forecasting. And so that's where our data scientists that are working on these projects with our customers really come into play. And certainly the predictive engine that we're using to seed these plans. And these can be, things like neural networks, advanced statistical forecasting algorithms. But what we find is that we approach this from a lean planning standpoint, in that we're always looking at naive forecasts. So that could be simple moving averages. It could be a random walk where you're just plugging in the prior period's forecasts or actuals into the forecast. If it's it's a fairly consistent flow of demand or supply. So we're always comparing the more advanced statistical models to naive forecasts, and because it's all about driving a lean process here. And so if your naive forecast, which, like I said, could be a simple moving average or a random walk, are more accurate than going through gyrations to generate some highly technical statistical forecasting process, then go with the least cost option, and you'll have better, or at least the same forecast accuracy by using naive models than some fancy statistical neural network or something like that. No clear answer on what are the best. We'll certainly backtest all the forecasting methodologies that we apply to a forecast to determine what the best method to use going forward. We'll use holdout data to test those methodologies to determine the least error rates. But again, always think about, hey, is there a inexpensive way to generate a forecast without spending cycles and mind share just to have a great algorithm? Answer is
Absolutely.
a couple different ways. Use a forecast value add to measure what way would be the least cost and most effective, and certainly backtest all your algorithms to determine error rates, MAPE, and any of those type of measures to determine how accurate these forecast methodologies are.
All right, appreciate that.
Yeah, that's all the questions. Yep.
Awesome. That puts us right up against the time block anyway. So thanks, Dan, for sharing the floor with me. And more importantly, thank you, everyone, for joining and listening. As I mentioned, the next one will be on April 9th. Be sure to go to QueBIT.com/events to stay current, and also look out for the recording in case you want to share this with any of your team members. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.